All right. So, how the debate is going to go. The title of the debate is Did Jesus Claim to be God? We're going to have opening statements. We're going to have rebuttals. We're going to have counter rebuttals. There will be clocks for the speakers to see. You guys won't see them. And then after all of that, we're going to move the table to the middle, and we're going to do open dialogue. And then after that, we're going to do some Q&A, just like we've been doing the past couple nights. Ray Rock with the microphone. Do not grab his microphone, okay? He's real serious about it. And so we're going to go for, I'd say, at least 2 hours tonight, okay? It's going to be a fun night. And we're going to have both gentlemen give opening statements, 20-minute openings, okay? And it's going to be fun. So let me introduce our speakers for the night, our debaters for the night. First up, who will be arguing the affirmative, ladies and gentlemen, warm round of applause for David Wood. Oh yeah. The podium is right here. David Wood, ladies and gentlemen. All right, and all the way from London, England. I've had a blast getting to know this brother for the past couple of days. It's been super fun, and he's probably going to hate me for saying this, but he actually joined us on his birthday weekend. All right. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, warm round of applause for Alex O'Connor. All right. Oh, yeah, we're good.
Good.
Are you ready? Tell us when you're ready so we can start the clock.
I'm ready now. Oh, you started. Okay. Well. Good evening. Good evening. What a beautiful audience. You're all breathtaking. This is how you charm a crowd in America, son. I'd like to thank Ruslan for arranging this conference and this debate, one of many awesome debates taking place in 2025, pitting heroes against villains. I won't say who the villain is in this debate. I'll let all you lovely Christians judge that for yourselves. Based entirely on our accents. And speaking of British accents, I'd like to thank Alex for finally showing up. You got to give me some wiggle room on time, Ruslan. Or you can all quit cheering for Alex. All right. No, I'd like to thank Alex for finally showing up. He's a month and a half late, but he finally showed up. I'm teasing, by the way. People have no clue how dangerous DebateCon is actually with the lineup they had and the number and the volume of death threats against multiple speakers. So, plus he lives in what is rapidly becoming the Sharia-compliant hellhole of the universe. So, good to take precautions. We don't want to lose Alex. By the way, are you guys starting to miss Jesus over there in the UK? Seems like you should be missing Jesus by now. Speaking of Jesus, did Jesus claim to be God? Yes, he did. And I'm sure many of you have some verses going through your heads right now. However, I'm convinced that the primary way Jesus claimed to be God, and that his followers claimed he's God, gets overlooked by most Christians and non-Christians because we've lost touch with first century Jewish culture, and we just tend to not notice things. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Boyarin in his book, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of Jesus Christ, the story of the Jewish Christ. He says, most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century, and even later, can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of the period. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. So the ideas were there, paving the way for Jesus, who embodied them. Now, who is Daniel Boyarin to say that Christian ideas like the Trinity and the incarnation were already present in some form in first century Judaism? Is he a Christian apologist? No, he's a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. He's a Talmud scholar. He points out that a lot of the beliefs we now think of as distinctively Christian actually weren't. The earliest Christian church was embedded in first century Jewish culture, but as Christianity spread, it became dominated by Gentile Christians who tended to lose touch with the Jewish framework. And something was happening within Judaism as well. As Jewish orthodoxy was forming in the 2nd century, the rabbis tended to weed out certain ideas that had once been familiar in Judaism, but which had been adopted by Christians. The rabbis wanted to clearly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and some of the ideas that were present in first century Judaism were soon deemed heretical. So Christians lost touch with the Jewish framework of early Christianity, and Jews abandoned some of the Jewish ideas that became part of Christianity. And the result is that today it's easy for us to miss a few things when we're reading the Bible. Claims that would have been understood by listeners at the time might not be understood by us. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to briefly discuss the forgotten Jewish idea that's most relevant for understanding how Jesus claimed to be God. And then I'll show how this forgotten Jewish idea illuminates various passages in the New Testament. Some of you are familiar with the early Jewish belief in the two powers in heaven. Alan Siegel, a Jewish scholar, drew attention to this in his 1977 book, Two Powers in Heaven. And lots of people, especially Christians, have been interested in the topic ever since. Here's the idea in a nutshell. The Old Testament is very clear that there's one true God. But there are numerous passages in the Old Testament where we see two divine figures. I'll give a few quick examples. There are tons of these. Sometimes God seems to be in two different places doing two different things. A common example is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that he's going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see firsthand how bad the people are. So he goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happens? Genesis 19:24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord on earth rained down fire from the Lord out of heaven. This thing reboot every couple minutes. It sounds like there are two lords here. Watch what happens in Zechariah 2. Pay attention or you'll miss it. Come, Zion, escape, you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. Who's speaking? The Lord Almighty. And he says, after the glorious one has sent me, the Lord was sent by the glorious one, against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The Lord Almighty was sent by the Lord Almighty. Next paragraph. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord, Yahweh. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord, Yahweh, will live among them, and they will know that the Lord was sent by the Lord Almighty. So Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh. Yahweh is sent by Yahweh. Plenty of passages like these. Then we got a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. Whatever you think of when you think about angels, just get rid of that. The angel of the Lord is no ordinary angel because this angel is somehow the Lord. Angel just means messenger. In Hebrew, it can refer to a human messenger, a spirit messenger, or in this case, the Lord himself. Look at Judges 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down to talk to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Then it switches to, the Lord turned to him. The Lord answered. Then it goes back to the angel of the Lord. Then, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. If you see the Lord in all his glory, you're dead. But if you see the angel of the Lord, who is somehow the Lord, you might survive." One more example of this. Here's Jacob blessing Joseph in Genesis 48. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys." He, singular. So the God, and the angel are all referring to the same being. The angel is God, but the angel is the messenger of God. This is all over the place in the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God, but there were two powers, two authorities in heaven. If you put all of the passages together, it seems like there's God you can't be around because his presence would destroy you, and God you can be around somehow. There's God you can't be around and God you can be around. The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. If there's one God, why are there two powers in heaven? Why are there two powers who both act like God? They tried to deal with this problem in a number of ways, but mainly they were confused. And then Jesus came along. And he says, in effect, you know those two powers that you've been reading about in the scriptures? You know those two powers that you're so confused by? I can tell you about those two powers because I'm one of them. That's the primary way Jesus claims to be God. It's the primary way his followers claim that he's God. And it's the primary issue that enrages his opponents. But did Jesus really claim to be one of the two powers in heaven? Since Jesus is a highly controversial figure, and since there's a skeptic in our midst, I would suggest that if we want to know what someone like Jesus is claiming about himself, we can look at 6 things. We can look at what Jesus says, and what Jesus does, what he says and does as they relate to our topic. We can look at what his friends say and what his friends do. Here I mean what they say and do in reaction to him. And we can look at what his enemies say and what his enemies do, again, in reaction to him. So what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, what his enemies do. I would put all of that together and say that's our evidence that we need to account for, and that will give us the best indication of what Jesus was claiming about himself. I don't have a ton of time left, so we'll consider a few things Jesus says and does and a few things his friends say and do. Along the way, we'll see the reactions of some of his enemies, and maybe I'll add a few more examples in the rebuttals. What does Jesus say? Jesus claims to be one of the two powers in heaven in multiple ways. I'll give you 3. The most familiar is the Father-Son language he uses. Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Now, someone can be a son of God in various ways in the Bible. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. But Jesus claims to be the Son of God in a unique divine sense. One example, Matthew 11:27, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father. And no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." All things were handed over to the Son by the Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. Obviously, the people around Jesus knew him in some sense, but they didn't really know him. Only the Father really knows him. And no one knows the Father except the Son and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. No one can know the Father unless the Son chooses to reveal him. This should sound somewhat similar to the Old Testament idea that there's God you can't be around and God you can be around. Two powers, Father and Son. Jesus is the Son. Mark 12. While Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, "Why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David?" David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? Whose son is the Messiah? He's the son of David, but David calls the Messiah his Lord. How many lords do we have here? The Lord said to my Lord. According to Jesus, the second Lord here, the Lord of King David, is the Messiah. So we've got two powers in heaven, and Jesus is one of them. On a side note, if you're a Christian and you're wondering why we're talking about two powers instead of three, where's the Holy Spirit? He's there, but we're focusing on how Jesus claimed to be God, and that's connected to the two powers in heaven. Mark 14. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. What do the enemies say? This is blasphemy. What do? Tear their garments. That's what they do when they're outraged about blasphemy, and condemn him as deserving death. Why do they react like that? The Son of Man, that's Jesus' favorite title for himself, will be seated at the right hand of power. So there's the power, which sounds like God, and there's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. How many powers in heaven? I see two here, and Jesus claims to be one of them. So who is Jesus claiming to be at his Jewish trial? He's claiming to be the Son of Man prophesied in Daniel 7:13-14. Daniel says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So there's the Ancient of Days, God, but there's also the Son of Man, who will be worshiped by all nations, whose dominion is everlasting, and who comes with the clouds. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is the one who rides the clouds. Humans don't, angels don't. Isaiah 19, see, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. Psalm 104, the Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. So God comes with the clouds. So we've got the Ancient of Days, who sounds like God, and we've got the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, who sounds like God. Two powers in heaven, and Jesus claims to be one of them. Jesus claims to be one of the two powers in heaven multiple times, multiple ways, in multiple sources. Jesus says a lot more than that, but what does Jesus do? Jesus judges the world. In the Old Testament, David says, the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness. Who's the judge here? Yahweh. But in Matthew 25, Jesus declares, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Jesus goes on to say that he will admit certain people into heaven and cast others into hell. Why is Jesus the final judge? He tells us in John 5, for the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. If you don't honor God you can be around, you don't honor God you can't be around. Jesus also raises the dead at the resurrection. According to the Old Testament, Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. 1 Samuel 2:6, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. But Jesus says he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. John 5, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself, and he gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. So Jesus claims by what he says and what he does that he's one of these two powers in heaven, and that means he's claiming to be God. And his friends got the message. How do his friends react? What do the early Christians say? In Philippians 2, Paul quotes an early Christian song or poem or creed about Jesus. It goes like this: "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." What's the name that is above every name? Yahweh. And at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. This is a reference to Isaiah 45. In verse 18, Yahweh says, "I am the Lord, and there is no other." Then in verse 23, he says, "Before me every knee will bow, by me every tongue will swear." The early Christians said, that's Jesus. So Jesus was in very nature God. Then he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. Then God exalted him. How many powers do you see here? 2, and Jesus is one of them. Paul quotes that and obviously agrees with it, but look at how Paul describes the two powers. "For us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." There is one God, the Father. You see, Jesus can't be God. It's only one God. Well, keep reading. "And one Lord, Jesus Christ." Does that mean that Jesus is Lord, but the Father isn't? All Paul does here is take two titles for God and says, I'll call the Father God and Jesus Lord. Two powers, and Jesus is one of them. What about John 1? "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." There's God, and there's the Word, but the Word was God. How many powers? 2, and Jesus is one of them. If you really want a fun verse later in the same chapter, try John 1:18. "No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." Sounds like two powers. It's what the early Christians say, among other things. What do? Wrapping up, they worship him. They pray to him. They sing hymns to and about him. They baptize in his name. They compose liturgy and doxologies to honor and praise him. In other words, they give Jesus the full array of religious honors. What could convince a bunch of first century Jews that a carpenter from Nazareth was one of the two powers in heaven? Probably the same thing that convinced his enemies that he was guilty of blasphemy. Would have to be something big, either really big claims of Jesus or a really big misunderstanding. We'll see which option Alex goes with.
All right. That is David Wood's opening statement, and Alex is going to take the podium for his 20-minute opening statement. David went over 1 minute and 14 seconds. So we will give Alex a grace period of 1 minute and 14 seconds.
Can everybody hear me through here? Yes, David didn't factor in the clapping. I always factor in clapping into the timing of my speeches. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Or as we say in England, assalamu alaikum. I must apologize for the previous debate fiasco. David's right that most people don't know what happened. A lot of accusations thrown my way, but I suppose that is the essence of our debate this evening. People thinking they know a thing or two about a person without hearing it from their own mouth. To which effect, I was thinking about how to approach this, given that I didn't know which approach David was going to take. I woke up this morning in this fine resort. opposite Legoland, which means that there's a roller coaster just outside of my room, and being a bit jet-lagged, I woke up quite late to the most peaceful of noises, that is, the sound of children screaming for their lives. Hearing the sound of innocent children screaming for their lives, of course, reminded me to read the Old Testament, and I wanted to begin with a verse. That was too easy. I factored that into my time as well. I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily, and that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, or the psalmist is talking about, the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm, he says, I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that people who believed in these two powers was talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you, that all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day past his crucifixion and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship and his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too, one day. If this is a claim to be Yahweh, then, well, lucky us, I suppose. Now, it's difficult to know where to take this because, of course, there is a third really important Christological claim in John's Gospel, which is in chapter 8. I think it might be relevant to talking about the understanding of ancient Jews. And we'll see where this goes. Of course, famously, in chapter 8, Jesus is talking about eternal life, and his Jewish opponents say to him, they challenge him and say, well, our father Abraham, he died. Are you saying you're greater than him? And Jesus replies, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, and he was glad. And they say, what, you're not even 50 years old, and Abraham has seen you? And he says, truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. Why is that important? Two reasons. Firstly, he seems to claim pre-existence to Abraham, which is pretty significant, but also this invocation of the word I am, in Greek, ego eimi, which many people think is a callback to the divine name of God given to Moses in Exodus chapter 3:14. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses asks God, who shall I tell them has sent me? And God says, Eesha, Asher, Eesha, which means I am that I am who I am. So go and tell them that I am has sent you. It's interesting. But of course, the New Testament is not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And it's well known that the authors of the New Testament were using a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. This is something that was pointed out by J.R. Daniel Kirk, so I'm indebted to him for this. But if you read the Septuagint that the New Testament writers were using, and we have very good evidence to suggest that John as well is using the Septuagint, how is this verse rendered? Exodus chapter 3. God says to Moses, ego eimi ho on, which means something like, I am the one who is. So go and tell them, ho on has sent you. In other words, in the Greek version, ego eimi is just, as it is typically used in Greek, a way of saying, I am. And it's used commonly like this. In John chapter 9, the blind man is healed by Jesus. He runs into town. They say, is this not the man who was born blind? And he says, ego eimi, it's me. When Jesus is asked by the woman at the well, or the woman at the well says, I'm expecting the Messiah to come, Jesus says, I am he. Ego eimi, once again. That is how it is often used. So in the Greek Septuagint, we have I am ho on. I am the one who is. Go and tell them that ho on has sent you. In the Greek Septuagint, in other words, the abbreviation of the divine name is not ego eimi, it's ho on. And it's ego eimi that Jesus says. And in fact, Jesus says the words ego eimi 6 times in chapter 8 of John's Gospel. And yet this is the only time it seems to annoy anybody. Why is that? Well, maybe because it's got more to do with the fact that Jesus seems to be claiming eternality. But supposing for a moment that this really were an invocation of the divine name. I'm just willing to grant it. Let's say, okay, he was meaning to evoke this imagery of Exodus 3 by saying, I am. Here we have to understand, as David is quite right to point out, the cultural context of early Judaism. And there is a tradition in early Jewish texts, or at least texts of around the contemporary time to the Gospels, of endowing beings who are not Yahweh with Yahweh's name, and thereby enabling them to exert his authority as his representative on earth. David's already talked about the angel of Yahweh. And there is the suggestion that the angel of Yahweh is Jesus. That doesn't seem to make much sense to me. For a start, if you turn to Hebrews chapter 1, the very first verse says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son." In these last days. If Jesus is the angel of the Lord, way back in Exodus, the story of the Exodus, why is it that Hebrews says he's only spoken to us through the Son in the last few days? Likewise, in Acts chapter 6, Stephen is recounting a history of the Jews. And in it he says that an angel spoke to Moses through the burning bush. Not Jesus, but a messenger of Yahweh. It's a little bit strange, but suppose we just accept that the angel of Yahweh is a bit difficult to unpack. Augustine himself, by the way, said that the angel is correctly termed an angel if we consider him himself, but equally correct, he is termed the Lord because God dwells in him. What does that mean? I think it's an invocation of the divine name. This is most elucidated for me when we turn to non-scriptural Jewish writings of around the same period. For example, in 3rd Enoch, Metatron is called the little Yahweh, invoking the divine name, and in fact to the extent that the Talmud warns Jews not to confuse Metatron with Yahweh, because that seems to be the implication of what he's saying. But he is in fact just invoking the name. The most important example of this for me is the Apocalypse of Abraham, written around the same time as the Gospels. A Jewish text which tells the story of Abraham, who hears the voice of God, and he's terrified and he hits the ground. And he hears the voice of God speaking to an angel. And he speaks to an angel saying, "Go, Yahuel," that's the name of the angel, "of the same name, through the mediation of my ineffable name, consecrate this man for me and strengthen him against his trembling. Through the mediation of my divine name, which he's given to the angel Yahuel." Yahuel, by the way, Yah and El. It is a substitute for the ineffable name of Yahweh, the writing of which is forbidden. And that's why he's called Yahuel. And in fact, at one point, God is himself addressed as Yahuel in this text. Abraham is told by this angel Yahuel, "Stand up, Abraham, go without fear. Be right glad and rejoice, for I am with you. For eternal honor has been prepared for you by the Eternal One. I have appointed to be with you, and the generation prepared for you." So the angel, invoking the divine name, by the way, says to Abraham, "Rejoice, for I'm preparing for you, essentially, redemption, and it will come from your generation." And by the way, when Abraham finally stands up, one of the descriptions of Yahuel's appearance is that his hair is white like snow. Where have we heard that before? But interesting, isn't it? Let's think about the context of John 8:58. A lot of people forget that we're talking about Abraham. Why are we talking about Abraham? Why is it here that Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am"? Well, if I'm right that he is just identifying himself, and the thing that's important is the Abraham claim, could this stem from a similar tradition? This is what Andrew Perryman has suggested recently, that when he says, this whole thing gets kicked off because Jesus says, "Abraham rejoiced to see my day." Well, hold on a second. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, the angel Yahuel says to Abraham, "Rejoice, for from your generation will come one who will redeem you." So is it possible that a common tradition has Jesus referring to the fact that Abraham rejoiced to see his day because he was promised this redemption from the beginning of time? It's possible. It's a suggestion. I think it's quite an interesting one. But it is a little strange that Jesus claims to be pre-existent. He uses the present tense, "I am." It's worth bearing in mind that the Bible sometimes does this when it is talking about plans that are preordained from the beginning of time. For example, in Revelation chapter 13, we hear about the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. It's talking about Jesus there. Jesus wasn't crucified at the beginning of the world, but it talks about it almost in the present tense, or at least as if it happened there and then. Why? Because the plan for this redemption through the Lamb was set in stone from the beginning of time. So it talks about it as if it's in the present tense. Similarly, famously in the book of Jeremiah, God says to the prophet Jeremiah, "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you." He also says, "Before you were born, I consecrated you as a prophet." How can you consecrate someone as a prophet who doesn't exist yet? That means that Jeremiah must be pre-existent, right? He must be... No, not necessarily. It just means that God had this plan. It's a poetic way of saying that God already knew what was going to happen and had planned this from the beginning of time. So putting all of this together, there is an interesting interpretation of Jesus saying that Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And the Jews not understanding him, not getting it, he says, look, before Abraham was, I am. I am the fulfillment that was promised to Abraham and was from the beginning of time, and here I am. Now, of course, this is all exegesis, and it's a little sort of spotty. But the most important question is probably about blasphemy. David mentioned blasphemy in a different context earlier. Why is it that they pick up stones to stone him to death? Because, of course, if I'm looking for a sound exegesis of correctly interpreting the words of Jesus, I turn to his Jewish opponents, who consistently throughout the Gospels are always understanding him correctly. No, the theme of the Gospels, especially John's Gospel, is how comprehensively the Jews misunderstand what Jesus is saying. When he says, I and the Father are one, they say, you're claiming to be God. And he said, no, you're not getting me. When he says that he forgives sins, and they say, who can forgive sins but God alone? He says, you're not understanding me. And hopefully we can get into that, actually. And here, of course, when they say, we're going to stone you, we're not told exactly what blasphemy they think he's committed. Do we now just think that they got it right, that they correctly understood what he was saying? I'm not so sure. Especially considering that if you look in Acts again, I've already mentioned Acts 6, this is Stephen. Stephen is telling the story of the Jews to the Jewish authorities, who he's been brought before on charges of blasphemy. He's eventually stoned to death. Why? Because he has a vision. In Acts 7, filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Notice God, not the Father. Look, he said, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, the Jews cover their ears, run up to him and stone him to death. Notice the similarity, by the way, between this depiction, looking up and seeing the Son of Man sat at the right hand of God, or stood at the right hand of God in this case, and the claim that Jesus makes in his trial. It's quite interesting. Stephen is stoned to death for this. Did Stephen claim that Jesus was God here? Did Stephen claim that he was God here? Sometimes Christians act as if the only way to commit blasphemy is to claim to be God. That is simply not the case. In fact, in Acts chapter 6, we're told that Stephen has been fraudulently accused of blasphemy. They're making up charges against him. Here are the charges that they throw at him to bring him before the court for blasphemy. This man never stopped saying things against this holy place and the law. For we've heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses has handed on to us. Ladies and gentlemen, if changing the customs that Moses has handed on to us is enough to get somebody convicted of blasphemy, I'm not sure we should read too deeply into the accusations of blasphemy against Jesus. There's so much to say. I've got everything I want to respond to. We have rebuttal periods, so if I haven't responded to everything David has said, hopefully I'll get the opportunity then. But this idea of the divine name being invested into people and them having the authority of God without being Yahweh themselves is, I think, the important ticket here. One slightly less biblical example is a story recorded by Josephus, which came to mind when David was speaking. When Alexander the Great approaches Jerusalem in an attempt to conquer it, the crisis is averted when a priest whose mitre bears the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, bears the name of God, comes out. And what does Alexander do? He bows down before the priest. Was Alexander bowing down before the priest, or was he bowing down to the divine name that was in him? When every knee will bow to Jesus, what is the context? Jesus has been given the name that is above all other names. Given it. This is a common theme. And so David's right that we need to understand how the early Jews were interpreting the various verses that we were reading, but I don't think it lends too nicely to his interpretation. Jesus is constantly talking as if he's not speaking with his own authority. He's doing this all the time. The most instructive example for me is in John 12:44, when Jesus cries out, "Whoever believes in me, believes not in me, but in the one who sent me." That's if you read the NRSV. The NIV adds in the word only. Whoever believes in me, believes not in me only, but in the one who sent me. That word simply isn't in the Greek. It's a little bit strange. I want to talk more about that. I want to talk about authority and where it comes from. I want to talk about the forgiving of sins. I want to talk about worship for sure. And whichever one of those roads we go down is essentially up to David Wood. But I'm ready for any of them, so we'll see what comes up. Thank you for listening.
All right. So that is Alex O'Connor's
20-minute opening. So David is going to go back up to the podium. He is going to do a 12-minute rebuttal round.
All right, thank you, Alex. In my opening statement, I showed that in the first century, there was an interesting discussion within Judaism about the two powers in heaven. They had various ways of dealing with this. And we can see why when we read passages like Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So this is God saying to Abraham, take your son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, is when he starts to do it. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is the angel of the Lord saying, you haven't withheld from me your only son. And it was God who ordered Abraham to do this. So we have situations like this, and I argue that Jesus enters the discussion when they're confused about the two powers in heaven and claims to be one of them. And so there we looked at what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, and what his enemies do. Alex seems to suggest that there could be some sort of angel or something like this, or even a person who's endowed with this kind of divine authority. I got problems with this even here in Genesis. So look at what this said. Then the Lord, Genesis 33, then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way. Who is accompanying them and guiding them? Well, the angel of the Lord. But here he says, I'm not going with you this time. So this is the Lord speaking. It's not the angel of the Lord, and you say, oh, this is the Lord. This is the Lord speaking. This is the Lord speaking, says, I'm not going up with you now, when it was the angel of the Lord who was accompanying them. So these are the sorts of things you have, and people tried to figure out how to deal with this. And they came up, again, with all sorts of ways, and Jesus entered the picture and claimed to be one of the two powers in heaven. So what Jesus says, we went through 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers. He's the divine Son of the Father, he's the Lord of King David, and he's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we saw how people reacted to him claiming to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. In response, Alex was he quoted Psalm 82, and then Jesus using this passage. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. And Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? So Jesus is sent into the world, according to this passage. Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said, I am God's son? This is not, and I have no idea how you would ever read the Gospel of John like this, let alone anything else Jesus said. This is not Jesus saying, what, you're misunderstanding. I'm just a regular dude. Again, if this were the only verse in there, maybe, because given the rest of what we read in the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels, Jesus is not claiming to be a regular guy. He's using a legal technicality here that they should be aware of. They're saying, hey, here's what you're claiming. You're claiming to be the Son of God. This means you're claiming to be equal to God and so on, and therefore, this is blasphemy. And Jesus' response is, well, really? Well, in the Psalms, God calls people Elohim. Therefore, you can't just say calling someone some divine title is blasphemous and deserves a death sentence. You have to show that that the title is not from God, that it's not true, that it's false. Have you done that? No. Okay, you can't kill me. You can't just say there's a claim and therefore we will kill you over it. So that's a legal technicality. Again, if you're somehow reading this as, see, Jesus is just claiming to be a regular guy, wow. All right. So we have John 17:5. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. Why? Alex quoted John 17 to show that Jesus is just claiming some regular relationship that we can all have with God or something along those lines. What does Jesus say in the same chapter that Alex is quoting? And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding. So what Jesus does, we've looked at it. I think he said he's going to respond to it. So what does Jesus do? He's the judge. He's the final judge of all people, according to him. Again, the Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who's going to sit on his throne in judgment. Jesus said, yeah, that's me. The Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. The people in their graves are going to hear the voice of the Son of God. Now that is very strange if that's how we all are. We're all going to be raised from the dead by the Son of God. If that's him saying, oh, we're all just the same and we can all, you'll be in me and I'll be in you. Very strange way of putting things. What his friends say. Now, this is interesting. Alex quotes Stephen in Acts 7. Now, this is an awesome passage because this kind of proves everything I was saying in my opening statement. Look at this. So, Stephen rebukes the Jewish leaders in the harshest terms you can possibly rebuke someone. Watch what he says. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, and now you have betrayed and murdered him, you who have received the law that was given through angels but have not obeyed it. That is absolutely brutal. And guess what? They get mad, they don't get violent. Which what happens? When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven. Have they gotten violent yet? Looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man, remember that? The Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Oh, you got God and then just someone else. How many powers in heaven? When do they get upset? Watch when they get upset. I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. 2 powers in heaven, and Jesus is one of them. Now watch how they react. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. When do they get violent? When he says Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. That is the precise moment when they get violent. Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. So keep in mind, this actually supports me, right? I mean, this is one of the early Christians who gets stoned to death for saying that Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. And if you're thinking he's just a regular guy hanging out in heaven, first of all, you might want to check about someone being in the presence of God and what sort of person you'd have to be. But look what he, oops, do I have it? Oh, I don't have it. Right after this is when Stephen, I don't have it on the slide. Right after this is when Stephen looks up and says what? Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Is that just a regular guy in the presence of God up there? No, that's someone who receives the spirits of people. Is that a regular guy? So Alex thinks this is just God endowing someone with authority. Does not look like that. Jesus seems to be the authority here. And this not only gets Stephen killed, this sets Paul on a rampage. Paul says, I have to wipe this stuff out. Why? We're told in the book of Acts what really sets Paul off. When Ananias is told that Paul is coming, well, Saul back then, he says, he's been told to apprehend everyone who calls on this name. Why is that an issue, calling on the name? That's how you describe prayer in the Old Testament, calling on the name of Yahweh. And Paul sees the Christians calling on the name of Jesus the way they're supposed to call on the name of Yahweh. Why is this relevant? Paul converts to Christianity about 2 years after the crucifixion. When is this taking place? This is not something that happens 50 or 60 years after the time of Jesus. We have Christians calling on the name of Jesus as they call on the name of Yahweh, and we can trace it to within 2 years of Jesus' crucifixion. So if this is a misunderstanding, that's a pretty big misunderstanding, and Jesus must be the worst communicator of all time. Alex brings up the Septuagint responding to John. I didn't rely on the passages he's responding to. But if you want to go to the Septuagint in terms of interpreting the claims of the New Testament, let's go to Luke 6:46. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" If you want to talk about the Septuagint, there's only one other place outside the Gospels where they use this Lord, Lord. That's the Septuagint. And it's a translation of Adonai Yahweh, God. Adonai Yahweh. So that's the Lord Yahweh. But in Greek, they would translate Adonai and Yahweh as Kurios. So it's Kurios, Kurios in the Septuagint. And here Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" And so if you want to interpret Jesus based on the Septuagint claiming to be Yahweh, here you go. There it is. And it's in the Gospel of Luke. So at the end of the day, the claim is that everything is just some sort of big misunderstanding. This is very, very, very strange to me, because you're basically saying Jesus was not a good communicator. You know, you think about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan and the golden rule and so on and so on and so on. Jesus seems like the best communicator of all time. He's careful about what he's saying, and sometimes he unveils things in different ways, but when he makes a point, it seems people get this point. If all of his followers just seem to misunderstand him and start worshiping him and praying to him, making doxologies for him and so on, putting their liturgy around him, then you're saying Jesus was just a terrible, terrible communicator. And that, I have to say, is the one option I cannot accept here.
All right. So now Alex is going to go up to do his 12-minute rebuttal.
It gets a bit messy, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, because, of course, we're responding to each other at cross purposes. I respond to an opening, he responds to my opening. I sort of have to take it back a few paces, but I'll try to make it interesting. We heard about the angel of Yahweh and the suggestion that this might indeed just be Jesus. It might be. Look, I don't claim to be the sort of final authority on exegesis here. I'm simply asking you to consider what you think is a more appropriate explanation. I've suggested the divine name-bearing model as opposed to the two powers in heaven. And when I look at passages such as Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, "See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him." I just ask which interpretation lends itself more nicely to the passages. David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude. That is far, far from the case, especially in John's Gospel, where Jesus seems to posit himself as something of a model of faith for his disciples. And for what it's worth, this is kind of the image that I get of Jesus reading through the Gospels. What is he supposed to be? Something like an idyllic, faithful servant of God, and certainly in a special position. If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking about Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know. That word grasped there, harpagmon, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it. He's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names. Again, which interpretation lends itself more nicely to these passages? For what it's worth, my favorite interpretation, I was discussing this the other night at dinner with, well, not with David actually, that would be giving too much away, but is this so-called Adamic. James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God, if we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems, Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized, not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2 that for a time Jesus is made lower than the angels, presumably while he's here on earth. Again, it just reads to me as if at least while on earth, Jesus is certainly not approximating Yahweh, but he's also not just some dude. David mentioned the glory that's given to Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 5, the same chapter that I was using. Yeah. Verse 5, Father, glorify me in the presence that I had with you before the world was created. Just keep reading John chapter 17 and see what Jesus wants to do with that glory. In fact, the very passage that I quoted, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray that all may be one, Father, just as you're in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, blah, blah, blah. Immediately afterwards, so they may be brought into complete unity. Then they will know, I've copied the wrong passage actually. Jesus says that the glory you've given me, I will give to them. In John chapter 17. He says, the glory you've given me, I will give to them, the disciples. We're told in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, that God shares his glory with nobody. And this is sometimes a suggestion that's made is sometimes that because Jesus says, glorify me, God, in John chapter 17, he must be God because God shares his glory with nobody. But people just seem to forget that in the same chapter, Jesus says that he will give the glory that he has been given by the Father to the disciples too. Again, all I'm asking you to consider is however you interpret these verses where Jesus is given glory, Jesus is given the judgment, and bear in mind that Jesus is given all of these things, what he then does with those things, and whether he delegates them to other people. Because if he does, then it's clearly not just something that can be delegated to God himself. Only God judges. Only God can judge, but Jesus says that he will judge. Jesus also promises judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So are the disciples God. Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins. In John chapter 20, verse 21, he says, as the Father has sent me, again, kathos, just as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. If you forgive people's sins, their sins will be forgiven. If you do not, their sins will be retained. I'm told that only God forgives sins, but then Jesus gives that ability to his disciples. In other words, all of these things which are supposed to indicate that Jesus has a special relationship with God, of course he does, but it's a relationship that he hopes and literally prays that will be shared with everybody. Also, this Luke chapter 6, verse 46 thing that David put up, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. As far as I understand, in Luke chapter 6, verse 46, when it quotes, Lord, Lord, and as far as I understand, David was saying that in the Hebrew, this is presumably Yahweh Adonai, right? Is that right, David?
I did not come.
Yahweh Adonai in the Hebrew. Perhaps he'll address it in his second rebuttal. And then said, but in the Greek Septuagint, this is translated as Kyrios, Kyrios, because it's Lord twice. Which translation of the Old Testament are the New Testament writers using? The Septuagint. So the passage that they read will have said Kyrios, Kyrios, Lord twice. It wouldn't have said Yahweh and then Adonai, or rather the other way around, I think it is. It would have said Kyrios, Kyrios, So, of course, they're willing to use this in Luke's gospel, because it says the same word twice, which to them just means Lord, because that's the translation that they're reading. Also, this idea that Jesus is a perfect communicator, David is like mocking this idea, saying, am I supposed to understand Jesus as just being a terrible communicator? Well, if you look at the way that the Jews were interpreting him, like, kind of. At the very least, people were deeply confused. Everybody was confused, not just his Jewish opponents because they were hardened of heart. His disciples regularly struggled with his teachings too, asking him to expand and explain what on earth he meant. It even says at one point that Jesus was speaking in parables so that, quoting a psalm again, they will be ever seeing, ever looking but not seeing, ever hearing but not understanding. The Gospels tell us that Jesus was speaking intentionally in such a way that people would misunderstand him. And then it says, but when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. So no, I don't actually think that Jesus' public ministry was entirely clear to everybody who was listening. In fact, that's part of the point. We're told that Jesus is constantly trying to hide his identity because he has to be careful about how he expresses himself, which, by the way, seems to raise a contradiction. When you consider the fact that we're told that in at least John's Gospel, Jesus is going around willy-nilly calling himself God, in the full view of his disciples and also his opponents, he invokes the divine name, and anybody listening would have completely understood what he was saying. And yet throughout the Synoptic Gospels, there is a motif, the Messianic secret, so it's called, that every time he reveals his identity, he tells them not to tell anybody. Don't tell them I'm the Messiah. But it's fine for them to know that I'm God. I don't know about that. I think the best way of understanding who Jesus is, like I say, a sort of idyllic human being. Take when Jesus walks on the water, for example. Another example that's often given as a high Christological moment, because of course in Job 9 it says that only God treads upon the waves of the ocean. Sure, but people then also forget that Peter also walks on the water just afterwards. But Peter starts sinking, and Jesus says, you don't have enough faith. What does that imply? That if Peter had enough faith, he could have kept walking on the water. What are we to take from this? If Jesus is supposed to be God because he walks on the water, but then Peter walks on the water too, I don't think that's a very good interpretation. In other words, we're told that God forgives sins, but then the disciples are given the authority to forgive sins in John chapter 20. We're told only God walks on the water, but then Peter does this immediately afterwards. We're told that only God can have the authority to judge, as David says, but the disciples are promised judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel. That's not the only time the judgment is delegated, by the way. We're told that Jesus explicitly claims identity with God by saying he and the Father are one. But then Jesus prays that his disciples will be one in the same way. We're told that God will share his glory with nobody else, but Jesus claims to have had glory with the Father before he was born. But Jesus then says he wants to share that glory with the disciples. We're told that Jesus only rightly accepts worship. This is interesting, by the way. David flashed on a few passages of Jesus accepting worship in the Gospels. The word most commonly translated as worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which means to bow down or prostrate before a higher authority. And of course, Jesus received this proskuneo worship, therefore he must be God. If that is the case, then we have to consider the fact that David, in the Septuagint, for example, bows down proskuneo before Esau, that Joseph's brothers proskuneo before him when he's governor of Egypt, that the entire nation of Israel offers proskuneo worship to King David as well, that Lot proskuneo before two angels. Proskuneo is littered throughout the Old and also the New Testament, by the way. In the parable of the unmerciful servant, when one of the servants returns, he offers proskuneo to his master. And this is a story that Jesus is saying. Also, let's not forget that in Revelation, Jesus promises that his true followers, their enemies, will proskuneo, worship before them. Jesus himself in Revelation is saying that human beings will receive proskuneo worship. If proskuneo worship is something that only God can receive, then all of these people sinned. All of them. The entire assembly of Israel sinned when they bowed down before David. I don't think that's a good interpretation. There is another word that's sometimes translated as worship, which is latruo. This is religious cultic worship that is only offered to God. Nowhere in the Gospels is this offered to Jesus. How many times is proskuneo worship, how many times is any kind of worship accepted by Jesus in Luke's Gospel? Does anybody know? Zero. The word comes up 3 times. Twice in the temptation of the desert where it's discussed, and once at the end after Jesus has ascended so he can say nothing about it, and in a verse that's contested in our manuscript traditions. How many times in Mark does Jesus accept worship? This time the answer is 2, but one of those is the demon Legion. It's usually translated as throws himself at his feet before Jesus. And the other is when the Roman soldiers mockingly worship Jesus. They offer proskuneo. Why? Because he's the king of the Jews. Because proskuneo worship is something offered to kings, higher authorities. I'll keep going perhaps in my further rebuttal, but if worship is something that is only due to God, then there are a lot more sinners in the Bible than we think. Okay, thanks.
All right, so now David Wood is going to do his second 6-minute rebuttal, and then that will be followed up by Alex's 6-minute rebuttal.
All right, Alex says we're looking for the best explanation. I would submit that the best explanation for Jesus claiming to be one of the 2 powers in heaven, and for claiming to do things like judge the world and raise the dead at the resurrection, and for why his followers are praying to him and worshiping him and calling him God and the Son of God, and doing the same thing, doing the exact same thing that Jesus does, namely claiming to be one of the 2 powers in heaven, and for his enemies to repeatedly accuse him of blasphemy, ultimately sentence him to death, and then people who say the same thing, like Stephen, also find themselves being executed. I would say that the best explanation of that is Jesus was claiming to be God. That's just me. It's like if I met like 5, suppose I never heard a word from Alex, but I meet like 5 of his biggest fans, and they say, yeah, we love Alex, he's the Messiah. And then I run into 5 of his harshest critics, and they say, man, we can't stand that dude Alex, he thinks he's the Messiah. Even if I never heard a word from Alex, I'd be thinking he was claiming to be something like that, and that's what's giving his friends and enemies that indication. Likewise with Jesus, even if I didn't have any words of Jesus, if I just knew these guys were people were being put to death for making these kinds of claims, and that his followers are going around worshiping him and praying to him, I would think he's saying something. Now, Alex apparently thinks that the best explanation is this divine name-bearing scenario. If so, Jesus did a really terrible job of getting that message across, and it doesn't seem like anyone really got the point unless we do some creative interpretations of some passages. Alex again quotes Exodus to say that the angel of the Lord is just some representative who bears the name. Again, I quoted the exact same book he quoted where Yahweh says that I'm not going along with you anymore, which is Yahweh saying that he was the angel of the Lord who was guiding them. He says that his view is that Jesus is presented as the ideal servant of God. The ideal servant of God convinces people to bow down and worship him and pray to him and so on. This is what the ideal servant of God would do. That's a very strange ideal servant of God, since that's kind of precisely what you shouldn't do if you're not God. He says that proskuneo can mean bow down. Yes, the word proskuneo depends on the context. If it's a religious context, it refers to worship. Someone can just bow down to you out of respect, and that would be, you can bow down to a normal human. But guess what? We have clearly religious context in some of these passages. For instance, Matthew 14:33, they are freaked out. Those who are in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. It's a different sort of context than I want to ask you for a favor and I want to bow down out of respect. As for Philippians 2, it sounded like he was saying, Dunn's theory, that this is just saying that when it says who was in very nature God, it's actually the form of God, but this is just saying that he was a human being, and since he found himself as a human being, like we're all the image of God, he humbled himself, and therefore he was eventually exalted, and so on. It just doesn't work. Let me just read it. Who being in very nature God, or you can just make up a translation and say image of God for fun. Who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Yes, that can mean seize. It can also mean used to his advantage. You look at what makes sense in context. Did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. The decision to humble himself is what led to him being made in human likeness. This isn't a human being who's sitting around going, hey, I'm in the image of God. I could strive to be like God, like Adam did, but I'm going to humble myself instead. This is a divine being humbling himself by becoming a human being. And then, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him in the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Alex seems to think that if you're a human being and you humble yourself in this way, that God can just exalt you to the status of Yahweh and apply these passages that are just Yahweh when Yahweh says there's no one else but me. That's what's being quoted there from Isaiah. As for kurios, Alex says, well, what would they be using? They would be using the Septuagint, the Greek translation. Yeah, and they went to a passage, they used the formulation kurios, which is specifically referring to Yahweh. That's what Jesus uses. He's quoting kurios. He's calling himself kurios. The only other use of that is the Septuagint, where it refers to Adonai Yahweh. So why is Jesus using that? And again, I only brought up that point because he brought up the point about the Septuagint and using it to interpret the claims of Christ. So I said, fine, let's go with it. We got in Luke, and therefore that's him claiming to be Yahweh. Was Jesus a bad communicator? He says, but Jesus wasn't clear, and he veiled his statements. So yes, I grant all of that. Jesus was a careful communicator. He was careful about how he communicated certain things. He tried to unveil certain things over time when people were ready for it. That's not what I consider a bad communicator. I consider all of that part of being a very good communicator. If you're saying that the people who all heard Jesus all got it wrong somehow, or that we don't really have the records of the people who somehow got it right, that his friends got it wrong because they continue and they build their church around him, and his enemies are sentencing him to death, I would say that's a really, really, really bad communicator, and that just does not line up. If everyone is concluding the same thing about this guy, that he's claiming to be God, that he's claiming to be one of the two powers in heaven, the best explanation is not some idea that no one got. The best explanation is very simple. He was making those claims. That's why we have all this evidence.
All right. Check. Okay, so now Alex is going to do his second 6-minute rebuttal.
Okay, I suppose I really want to nail down on this worship point, since I was kind of getting at that at the end. And David says, yeah, proskuneo can mean just simply bowing down, but in a religious context, it means something else. Like, what do you mean? How do you know that without begging the question? Like I say, let's actually evaluate. That's what I was sort of going through, how many times proskuneo worship is given to Jesus in the New Testament. Or at least that Jesus accepts it in the New Testament. It doesn't happen once in Luke's Gospel. It basically doesn't happen once in Mark, because it happens twice, and one of these is a demon, and one of these, which I suppose is an interesting thing to explore in itself, but one of these is them simply mocking Jesus because he's the king. Why would they consider mocking him with proskuneo worship if he was claiming to be king of the Jews? Because that's what proskuneo means. If proskuneo can mean actually worship of the kind that latruo usually gets at, that is worship, cultic worship of a religious figure, as David suggests, here's a riddle for you. Why isn't it given to Jesus after Jesus ascends? Why isn't it that people are offering proskuneo worship after Jesus ascends, except at the moment of his ascension at the end of Luke's Gospel, which, as I say, is contested in our manuscript tradition anyway? Why not? Because it refers to a physical action. Because it's not referring to worship of the kind that David wants it to be in this context. In John's Gospel, which we didn't get to, how many times does Jesus accept worship? The answer again is once. Just once it happens in John chapter 9. This is the man who was born blind, who I mentioned earlier. In verse 38, he says to Jesus, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Except he doesn't say so in Papyrus 75, he doesn't say so in Codex Sinaiticus, he doesn't say so in Codex Washingtonianus. In other words, this verse isn't present in our earliest manuscripts. We're pretty confident that there are elements of the Gospels which are later interpolations, most famously the ending of Mark's Gospel, which is not in our earliest manuscripts, and the story of the adulterous woman, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, which are not in our early manuscripts. I'm interested as to whether David thinks that there are things in the Gospels which didn't actually happen, either because they're recorded incorrectly or because they are later interpolations. But at least in this case of worship, it seems to be a later interpolation. But at best, we've got one instance of Jesus accepting worship in John's Gospel, and our manuscript evidence seems to suggest that there's none. If worshipping Jesus is supposed to be some indication of his divinity, then why is it only Matthew's Gospel who seems to mention anything to do with worship and uses a term when there's another one available to indicate cultic religious worship to someone who's divine? Yet he chooses a word which just means physical prostration before someone who has a higher authority, like, I don't know, maybe the Messiah. Like, the disciples bow down and worship Jesus. At what point do you think they began to get the picture that he was God? They knew that he was the Messiah for a long time, but I genuinely don't know when David thinks they began to realize that this person was God. Do you think there might be an instance of them offering proskuneo worship to Jesus before they'd fully realized that? I think so, because proskuneo worship is a physical action that's given to people who are of a higher authority. Just to belabor this point, in the Septuagint, here are some examples of proskuneo worship. Lot worships two angels in Genesis. Abraham worships the Hittites. Isaac blesses Jacob to have all the nations on earth worship him in Genesis. Jacob worships Esau. Joseph's brothers worship him. Abigail worships David's servants in 1 Samuel. Saul worships the dead Samuel in 1 Samuel. The sons of prophets worship Elijah in 2 Kings. David worships the temple in Psalm 5. All the people of Israel worship King David in 1 Chronicles. This is the same term, proskuneo. If David wants to suggest that sometimes this proskuneo worship can mean cultic religious worship, even though there's another word available that people use to mean that, but it's not being used in this instance for some reason, I want to know what that distinction is, and how we can know which kind of worship is being given without simply begging the question and saying that, well, when it's given to Jesus, it's obviously of the religious kind. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, this worship point is essentially bunk. Some of you might be thinking, hold on a second, in the temptation in the desert, Satan asks Jesus to worship him. And what does Satan say? Do you know? He says, "Worship, it is written, worship God and serve him only." So you're only supposed to worship God. And people say that this is an indication that any worship of anybody other than God would be immoral. That interpretation cannot be the case. Firstly, because it would condemn all of the people that I've just listed to be sinners, including the entire assembly of Israel. That can't be it. Let's look again at this passage. Jesus is quoting a passage which, by the way, he's actually changed. In the Old Testament, the passage that he's quoting says, "Fear God," rather than worship God. But besides the point, the word "only" here qualifies not the word worship, but the word serve. Worship God and serve him only. Worship here is proskuneo, which we know that Jesus can't be saying only proskuneo towards God, because all of these people, including people that Jesus talks about himself, are offered proskuneo worship. Indeed, proskuneo is worshipped, is promised to all of you in Revelation. So we know that he can't mean only worship God in that sense. But only qualifies the word serve. Worship God and serve him only. What is the word serve? Which Greek word is translated in this passage to serve? Does anybody know? Latruo, cultic religious worship. So this is a reaffirmation of the point that proskuneo worship is fine, but latruo worship is something special that can only be given to God. The key text here is James Dunn's, "Did the early Christians worship God?" And as he rightly points out, there is no talk anywhere once in the entire New Testament of latruo worship being offered to Jesus. Why not?
All right. Okay, so that concludes Alex's second rebuttal round. We're going to move to open discussion. All right. Well, shall we spark it off, gentlemen?
Whatever you like.
Let's do it. Open dialogue. Who would like to take the lead?
Well, I have some questions, perhaps, to ask David about his position on Jesus' relationship to the Father, with particular regards to the authority that he derives from the Father. So, one question, for example. Why do you think that Jesus prays before raising Lazarus from the dead?
The Old Testament says that God is the God of all flesh. If a divine being were to become incarnate, as is claimed of Jesus, and that divine being really became a flesh and blood human being like Jesus, then if he's also had an eternal relationship with the Father, then I don't know if I'd expect him to be an atheist when he entered into creation. So in other words, if the Christian picture is correct, you've got Father and Son for all eternity. Son enters into creation. What's he going to be, an atheist? If he is going to, as part of it is if he's going to be the ideal human or something like that.
Yeah.
And so
the Son of Man, one might say.
As far as what Jesus is going to do, you would continue the eternal relationship that you've had with the Father, and you would do that through prayer. So,
what I mean to say is, could Jesus have risen Lazarus from the dead of his own accord, on his own authority?
I suppose, yeah.
I suppose.
Because all authority has been given to him.
It's been given to him by God, right? Which the way that I read that is that the Father has delegated the authority that is rightfully his to Jesus. And it's often said to me that Jesus raising people from the dead of his own authority is actually an indication of his divinity. Because we have Old Testament passages of people raising people from the dead, like Elijah and Elisha. And the point is always made that, well, they pray before they rise from the dead. Jesus doesn't pray. But before he raises Lazarus in John chapter 11, he looks upward and says, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so they may believe that you have sent me. And when he says this, he cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. So Jesus is not only praying before raising Lazarus, but also saying that I always do this. It's just I'm doing it right now publicly, so there's no confusion that you're the one who sent me to do this. And so, even in instances where Jesus appears to perform miracles of his own accord, such as calming the storm, or indeed raising other people from the dead, like the widow's child, he tells us here in John's Gospel that he always is in communication with God beforehand, but right now he's saying so publicly, so that people will know that he sent him. Why does Jesus need to pray before he raises Lazarus from the dead?
This is the exact same chapter where Jesus declares himself the resurrection and the life.
That's right.
And it's in the same book where Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. Everyone who's in their graves will hear the voice of the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
So if you're thinking that when we talk about Jesus, we're thinking of him as some rogue deity who does things on his own, that's basically the entire meaning of John chapter 5. John chapter 5 is basically one response to this. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and this freaks him out because they say, hey, what are you doing? He says, well, the Father's working until now, I'm working too.
Yeah.
And so since the Father's working, I get to work. You all don't get to work, I get to work. And then they accuse him of claiming to be equal to God. And then he explains it. That it's a verse that Muslims use. He says, by my own self I can do nothing. But if you look at what he's saying, it's I can do nothing separately from the Father. But that's the same chapter where he claims that he's the final judge, where he claims that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. And he explains it and says, for the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Mm-hmm. The only way you'd honor the Son the same way you honor the Father is if they have the same nature and attributes. You wouldn't honor anyone else like you honor God.
Interesting. Do you believe
so Jesus is saying that the reason he's the one who judges everything is so that we honor him the same way we honor the Father. That sounds...
Do you believe that the Father has a distinct loving relationship to the Son compared to the loving relationship he has to all of us, say?
Yep.
Only because I've heard you make this point before, that he says that it's that word "as" is quite important, what you just said, so that he will honor, so that they will honor me just as they honor the Father. That word "just as" is kathos, which I mentioned earlier. That's also used when Jesus says, so they will know that you have loved me just as you have loved them. So if we're going to be consistent in our usage of the term here, if Jesus is saying like that they will honor you that they'll honor me just as you honor the Father, then the loving relationship has to be treated in the same way, right?
Well, I think you can say, I'm trying to think, if you say that, I could say I love this person just as I love my wife. And yeah, you'd be right. I could say, well, I just mean I love both of them, but not in the, that wouldn't necessarily be saying I love that person exactly as I love my wife. But
that's why there are two words in the Greek. That's why there's like the word for as.
No, I'm fine there. I'm talking about, you have to interpret words in context.
Yeah.
And what's the context of this? It's Jesus claims that since the Father is working, he's working also. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the discussion among the rabbis was,
does God work on
the Sabbath?
Yeah.
And so Jesus is working, so God works on the Sabbath because he's upholding and sustaining the universe, therefore I get to work on the Sabbath as well. And then, hey, you're claiming to be, they think he's claiming to be another God. And he clarifies, no, by myself I can do nothing. He points us out, and in this context, he's the final judge. And so you will honor the Son just as you honor the Father. There, in context, it would be very strange to say, well, I just mean honor me in some sense, like you honor the Father, but not in that way. The Old Testament, Yahweh's the one who sets up his throne to judge. Jesus is the one who says all judgment is given to him.
Given, yeah.
Yeah. And so if all judgment is given to him, and keep in mind, the Old Testament says Yahweh is the one who's going to judge. And you're saying, yeah, but it's given to Jesus.
Yeah.
And he says it's so that we honor him the same way we honor the Father.
Yeah, okay, so I want to talk about this Sabbath moment because this is quite important. This is in John chapter 5 as well. This whole episode sort of hinges on the idea that Jesus is working on the Sabbath. He says, my Father is working, so am I. So your interpretation of this is to say that, well, my Father in heaven, that is God, is working on the Sabbath, so am I, therefore I'm God. This story of Jesus working on the Sabbath is reported in multiple Gospels. In Mark's Gospel, when he's found working on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees say to him, this is Mark chapter 2, look, why are they doing that? It's that which is not lawful on the Sabbath. What does Jesus say in response? Have you not heard what David did? Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? And they enter the house of God and take the food which is not lawful on the Sabbath? So Jesus justifies his breaking of the Sabbath by referring to another human being who also broke the Sabbath. He then tells us that the Sabbath was made for mankind and not mankind for the Sabbath. A very famous quote. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Bearing in mind that although...
And the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yes, bear in mind that although in the Greek, the definite article is given to Jesus when he uses the term Son of Man, it's complicated by the fact that Son of Man without the definite article is just a way of saying human being. So there are some scholars such as Morris Casey who believe that these Son of Man sayings have been corrupted, at least some of them, from originally saying a Son of Man, or the Son of Man in the sense of just meaning a human being. Now, why would that interpretation be correct here? Because Jesus says, firstly, when he's accused of breaking the Sabbath, he says, well, David did the same thing. Was David sinning? The implication is no, which means it can't just be God who breaks the Sabbath. He then says that the Sabbath was made for man, humans, not humans or man for the Sabbath. Therefore, he says, the word is therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. If the Son of Man in some context just means a human being, that's how early church fathers interpreted it, for example. In fact, some of the early church fathers translated the Son of Man as the Son of Mary, because they thought it was Jesus indicating that he was the son of a human being and he was only born of Mary. Given that undertone for this phrase, the Son of Man, how else can I read this passage except Jesus saying, yeah, I'm working on the Sabbath, so did David, and that wasn't wrong. The Sabbath was made for mankind, therefore mankind is Lord of the Sabbath. If it's only God who can work on the Sabbath, then why does Jesus appeal to David?
You're talking about two completely different passages. You're talking about this situation, and Jesus, I was talking to a Jewish guy in Israel, and he's not a Christian, but he said, hey, Jesus' way won. Jesus' way actually won. The way of Jesus won.
Oh, sure.
He viewed Jesus as like a religious reformer sent against religious extremism and so on. There, Jesus is talking about like preserving life and so on. the accusation in John 5 is different, but I'm pointing to John because you're going with John.
Yep.
In John 5, he says the Father's working, and so he gets to work too.
That's right.
And again, if you read this, there's no way to interpret this as Jesus claiming to be some, just another human being or something like that.
Well, I don't think Jesus is claiming to be just another human being. But although we are talking about two different passages here, if the reason that Jesus gives, because bear in mind, there are multiple ways to interpret this. When he says, well, God's working, so why not I? There are multiple ways to interpret this. Either Jesus is, again, quite explicitly claiming to be God, which again is quite mystifying given that this doesn't seem to provoke the same kind of reaction. If it's well recognized that God is the Lord of the Sabbath and Jesus is claiming himself as a title, the Son of Man, to be the Lord of the Sabbath, or in this instance, just claiming the authority because God is working, so am I, it's strange that it doesn't cause the same kind of fuss. But the other interpretation is that Jesus is saying, well, if God can work on the Sabbath, why not anybody else? If God can work, why not me? And that just doesn't, your interpretation just doesn't square with me, with Mark's gospel. I mean, the question I asked was, why does he refer to David in justifying his working on the Sabbath?
We're talking about John.
Yes.
Yeah, you can have different reasons for doing things in different situations. I mean, as far as John, so Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. With God.
Yes.
And so that's when Jesus goes, and if he's trying to say something about it's okay to break the Sabbath or you don't have to work on the Sabbath anymore or something like that, it's a strange direction to go in that he makes all these claims. He can do only what the Father sees because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. The Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father. And that's when he goes on to say that he's the one who raises the dead. Time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. And then he goes on to say that the dead are going to be raised. My point is zeroing in on one little point and saying, maybe this is just, you're missing kind of the big picture. This is...
I'm noticing the words granted and given or authority there. This idea that Jesus raises the dead is not exactly clear in John chapter 5. Like if we look at the words that we're actually dealing with here, the Father judges no one but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. Presumably the Father could judge if he wanted to. He's made a decision to entrust this to the Son, meaning that the Son doesn't have this power necessarily. If the Son has this power necessarily, it's not something that needs to be entrusted to him in the way that the Father then would not have it. He then says, very truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who has sent me has eternal life. And goes on to say that the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live.
Hear the voice of the Son of God.
Yeah. Now,
he's the Son of God, right? Jesus?
That's right.
You're agreeing that he's claiming to be the Son of God.
Yeah, so they'll hear his voice and they'll be raised from the dead. But how do we, who is doing the raising here? And how do you know?
You're saying we're going to hear, people are going to, so you're saying someone else is raising them.
God.
When they hear the voice of the Son of God. So if they're dead, they're just bones. They hear the voice of the Son of God, and then someone else raises them.
For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to also have life in himself.
Life in himself.
Yes, any power that Jesus has here is given to him by the Father. Why is Jesus, if God, in need of being given this power by the Father? This is the exact same issue that you have in Daniel 7, where the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven approaches the Ancient of Days, and he is given authority, glory, and sovereign power. It's why is he being given authority and glory and sovereign power? Yeah.
But even before that, it's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Yeah. That's how he approaches. But again, it's Yahweh who comes with the clouds. So he's Yahweh, and then something happens, and then he's given...
Well, the Son of Man is Yahweh. Do you think that that was how Daniel 7 was interpreted by anybody before?
Daniel saw a vision.
That's
but
right.
This is one of the issues as far as this is one of the issues that comes up in the two powers in heaven.
Yeah.
Because it's, again, Yahweh is the only one who comes with the clouds in the Old Testament. And here you have the Son of Man who receives worship and so on, and is worshipped by all nations. But notice, he approaches, and then he's given authority, glory, and sovereign power.
Mm-hmm.
But if you line that up with the Creed in Philippians, if you line that up with John 1 and so on, you get kind of a big picture. And you can take like John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's after all things are created through him. And you find the same thing in Philippians 2, early Christian creed, when it's in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. So these are, you have someone who is in nature God over here, someone who is the Word through whom all things are created,
yes.
And then enters creation, and then lives as Jesus, dies. And I would interpret it, since you have the ending in Matthew where Jesus approaches and he's worshipped there, and he says that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. So the idea is he becomes a servant. He's in very nature God. He takes on the nature of a servant, and then he lives as a servant. And the irony of this statement where he says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The irony there is he's the Son of Man. He's supposed to be served by all. And he says that he came to serve. And so he's living as a servant during this life. Then he dies, he rises from the dead.
There's a lot here, right?
Yeah.
I want to go right back, because we started with this idea of the Son of Man coming on the clouds, meaning that he's Yahweh. Do you think that's how Daniel interpreted his vision? Do you think that's
I believe Daniel saw a vision and recorded his vision.
Do you think that's how the Sanhedrin interpreted Daniel 7? When Jesus comes for his trial, and he quotes Daniel 7, and says that you'll see the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven, do you think that the problem there was that Jesus was claiming to be God, and that's something that no human being can do? Because Daniel 7 is part of the Jewish scripture. They were expecting the coming of this Son of Man. So if it's obvious that the Son of Man was going to be Yahweh, then the Sanhedrin should have expected that the coming Son of Man would have been Yahweh. They might have thought that Jesus wasn't him. But do you think that the Sanhedrin were expecting whoever the rightful Son of Man was, who was to come, would be identical to Yahweh? And if not, why did they not read that into the passage as obviously as you think that they should have done?
People were basically confused by these passages. That's the impression you get. They go in all sorts of different directions, and, oh, this is referring to the Messiah. No, this is referring to some sort of angel. No, this is referring to this. No, I'm talking about what the text says. The Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven. All before that, it's always Yahweh who comes on the clouds. And so if you were looking at that and if you didn't have the idea of, wait a minute, it just can't be. It's impossible that is referring to God, because you've got the Ancient of Days right there. If you're not reading, and really, I don't even know what to do if you're saying that. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about anyone.
Yeah.
If you're reading that and going, no, it doesn't seem like this is God. He comes with the clouds of heaven, but then he's worshipped by all nations and has an everlasting kingdom. Mm-hmm. If you're just reading that, if you put it this way, if you didn't have the Ancient of Days in the picture and you're reading this description, comes on the cloud of heavens, worshipped by all nations, they obviously God.
Yeah, so
the mystery comes in. The mystery comes in when it's, wait a minute, we've got the Ancient of Days here, so this is sounding like two divine beings, and we just can't have that.
Real quick, so we've gone through about 20 minutes. David, are you comfortable staying here, or do you want to ask Alex some questions now?
We keep going
on this over there.
Hoping to nail this down, because of course the point was, or is, in the Christological dispute, that Jesus is accused of blasphemy at his trial, and that this is evidence that he was claiming to be God through his identification with the divine Son of Man, because that's how it's interpreted by the high priest, because he accuses him of blasphemy. Does that mean that the high priest was expecting the Son of Man to be Yahweh himself? Do you think that that is the interpretation that the high priest had of the Danielic vision of the Son of Man?
I would say they would obviously have interpreted that passage in Daniel, or claimed to be the Son of Man, in that sense. If you're just saying, hey, I'm a son of man, I think they'd be fine with it.
Well, yeah, of course, in the Aramaic in which Daniel 7 is written, it's one like a son of man, one like Bar Nash, which just means one like a human being.
Yeah, so you'd clarify that, and that's the point, like a human being, and yet he comes with the clouds of heaven. So he's coming with the clouds of heaven, he's Yahweh, and yet he's like a son of a man.
That's right.
Yeah.
You understand that in the history of...
As far as how they would interpret it, they could have a range of interpretations that we don't know what this means. But we know that the guy who built my cousin's table in Nazareth should not be making this claim.
Sure. Is that enough to be... So suppose that their interpretation was a messianic vision of Daniel 7. This carpenter claiming to be the Messiah, would that have been enough to accuse him of blasphemy?
Claiming to be the Messiah is not a death sentence. All kinds of people claim to be the Messiah.
So the reason I'm pressing this point is because when I say, did the high priest believe that the Son of Man was going to be Yahweh himself, I think that's quite implausible. And I think you recognize that in saying, well, look, there are loads of ideas that they could have had. It was quite confusing. But if Jesus wouldn't be accused of blasphemy for merely claiming to be the Messiah, if you had a messianic interpretation, he wouldn't be accused of blasphemy for claiming to embody the nation of Israel, if you have the idea that the Son of Man represents Israel, which is another view. It has to be.
Israel comes on the clouds of heaven?
It has to be.
And is worshipped by all nations?
I'm not saying that's my interpretation. Okay. I'm saying that in the history of the interpretation of Daniel 7, that has been a popular interpretation. Yeah, of course, the four beasts which come before represent different nations, and the one like the Son of Man is Israel. But the question I'm asking you is, surely you recognize that if the idea is that claiming to be the Messiah or something like that is not enough for a death sentence.
That's right.
Then what Jesus has to have done in that trial, in order to get a death sentence, must have been to say something that the high priest immediately interpreted as him claiming to be Yahweh. That means that he has to expect that the coming Son of Man would be Yahweh himself. Is that what you think what the high priest thought of Daniel's vision?
One, you just made an awesome case for me, right? If he's just thinking of the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven as the Messiah, then okay, this guy claimed to be the Messiah. Let's maybe we have to deal with the Romans or something like that. But it's not this terrier clothes blasphemy sort of thing. Mm-hmm. What you find in that passage, people struggle with that. Again, the reason is because it sounds like it's talking about Yahweh when the Ancient of Days is Yahweh. That's it. So you come up, you try to explain it in other ways. Could this be the Messiah? It just doesn't fit. Could this be the nation of Israel? It doesn't fit. There are all these interpretations, but it's clear if a guy says, you will see the Son of Man coming with at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Yeah, it doesn't seem like they were taking that to just be a claim to be the Messiah.
That interpretation, and you're right, that I'm bolstering the case here that Jesus must have been claiming to be Yahweh. What I'm saying is that if your position is correct, and that is the only thing that he could have been accused of blasphemy for, then you have to presuppose that the high priest had that interpretation of Daniel 7, which just seems so implausible to me. That's what they thought Daniel 7 meant. So that's what they thought at that time that it meant. That this Son of Man, who they did expect to come, would be Yahweh himself. Is that what you think they thought? Because you have to, for this to run.
I don't have the records of the high priest. If he says, this guy just claimed to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And again, if you just read the passage, if you just read in Daniel 7, if you didn't have the Ancient of Days there, it would be indisputable it's talking about God. But you've got the Ancient of Days there. So what's the context of this? First century, they're dealing with this two powers in heaven issue. And they don't know how to deal with it. They're coming up with all sorts of explanations for what this second power is. And then Jesus claims to be one of them.
When does the two powers in heaven, idea, heresy, if you want to call it that now, when does that begin to emerge?
BC.
What evidence do you have of the popularity of the two powers in heaven idea in Second Temple Judaism?
The main discussion that's used, like in Siegel's book, is the later rabbinic commentaries. But so you have
in like the late 1st and 2nd century, right?
Yeah, that's when they're talking about
it because it becomes it's a big deal.
That's when Jewish orthodoxy is forming.
So in other words, it's a relatively fringe position beforehand.
No, it was fairly popular.
What's your evidence for that? As far as I understand, it's a relatively fringe position.
You have all these issues that are in the Old Testament, but then you have the Targums. You have the Targums that are putting Old Testament passages into Aramaic and so on, and they start giving some interesting translations of some of these passages and so on, and treating. There's a lot of other issues, like even with the name and with the word, and that's why Boyarin says the ideas are already there, because you have passages where they're interpreting the word, where they're interpreting the word of God as a personal agent and so on. So the idea is that it's drawing a parallel between that and John's gospel.
Here's James McGrath on the two powers. The evidence surveyed thus far gives no support for dating the origins of the controversy even to the 2nd century. It is, of course, possible that the controversy did arise in the 2nd century, but it has not yet had sufficient impact to leave any clear or explicit trace in the traditions and literature from that period.
When you have the rabbis forming Jewish orthodoxy, they're clearly responding to the issue of the two powers in heaven.
Yeah, when's that happening?
Yeah, that's later, but they're talking about things that happened earlier.
But because remember, what we're talking about here is the idea of the Son of Man that the high priest would have had at Jesus' trial. If the two powers in heaven idea is something that only emerges in the late 1st and 2nd century.
No, that's when it's being labeled a heresy. That's when they're declaring it a heresy, right. And they're setting out to refute it.
But what I'm asking is why is it that if this is already a controversy that has emerged and is extant to the extent that the high priest believes it, then why is it leaving no trace in our traditions and literature from that period? What traditions do you have? What commentaries are you talking about from the 1st century? Well, that's a silence thing, because I don't have commentary. What commentaries do I have that don't mention it? That's a bit of a broad question. I'm asking what commentaries you have that do.
If the rabbis are talking about these earlier controversies and they're dealing with, because you have the Christians went one way with it.
Yes.
You had the Gnostics. It became an issue for the Gnostics because the Gnostics interpreted, they believed in the two powers in heaven, and they said they're basically in conflict. The two powers are in conflict. Yep. And so the Gnostics ran with that. And then you had Jewish mystics who were running with the issue.
You think the Gnostics believed in the two powers in heaven heresy as you've described it?
They believed in the two powers.
Because as far as I really actually don't know.
They went in a completely different direction. So the Christian direction was father and son. You've got Father and Son. You've got Son of Man coming with the clouds and Ancient of Days. You've got God and the Word of God. You've got Paul calling the Father God and calling Jesus Lord and so on. So you see it all over there. They have the two powers, but the two powers are in harmony and have always been so.
Yeah.
The Gnostics believed in the two powers, and they believe that they're in conflict. And so anyway, the point is.
Okay, look, I really don't know here, but I think that this hinges on the evidence that the two powers in heaven idea is a popular enough controversy in the time of Jesus' lifetime, that the high priest of the Sanhedrin would have believed it. And as far as I can see, the evidence...
You can tell what he believed by how he reacts.
So you do think that this is what he believed then? Like, you're committing yourself to that view, in other words, that this is the view that the high priest had of Daniel 7, that the Son of Man would be Yahweh, that even before Jesus came along, this high priest must have read Daniel 7.
I have no idea. He could have a range of ideas. So you just say you can't claim to be this guy.
You can't say you have no idea, because if your whole claim is that Jesus couldn't have been accused of blasphemy for anything other than claiming to be God.
I've never said that.
In this instance, like, what other interpretation of Daniel 7 do you think would this, let me put it this way, what interpretation other than the one that I've just described of Daniel 7 could the high priest have that would cause him to accuse Jesus of blasphemy based on the words that he said?
As far as you can tell in commentary, they can't figure out what it means, right? And so the question is, how is the high priest interpreting what Jesus is saying? So how are they interpreting what Jesus is saying?
And Jesus is identifying himself as the Son of Man, who they already expected to come from Daniel 7, and they interpret that as him claiming to be Yahweh?
It really looks like
because
that.
Because I think that's what you have to say, right? You have to say that they think he's claiming to be Yahweh. But in order to say that, you have to believe that that is how he interpreted Daniel 7.
Look, no, I don't. He could have a range of interpretations and say, like put it this way. Look at what the high priest is doing when he says, don't keep us in suspense any longer. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?
Yeah.
He's asking for clarification on what he's saying. What are you saying? What are you telling us?
Okay, so bearing in mind that one interpretation of Daniel 7 throughout history, even after the advent of Christianity, is that Daniel 7 is a messianic prophecy about the coming Messiah. If Jesus is asked, are you the Messiah? And he responds by quoting Daniel 7, if one of the interpretations of Daniel 7 is that it's talking about the Messiah, then why would they not just think he was claiming to be the Messiah?
He obviously didn't give them that impression if they said he deserves death for it. And by the way, this is connected. You can actually tell what happens. I mean, you brought up the passage in Acts 7. I mean, Stephen is giving his entire case for belief in Jesus as the Messiah. They never get violent. Then he rebukes them the harshest way you can possibly. You killed your ancestors killed all the prophets, and you guys killed the Messiah. If they're just going to get ticked off at rebuke or insults or something like that, that would have been the time to do it. It's when he says, I see the Son of Man. It's when I see the Son of Man. That's when they cover their ears. They cover their ears, they charge him, and they kill him. So you can do the same thing. Why are they interpreting that as...
Exactly.
Why aren't they interpreting that as he's just saying that Jesus is the Messiah?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
Why do they think that?
We got to move to Q&A. We've gone way over the open dialogue.
Apologies,
so if you have
everybody.
a question, line up over there while I let you guys finish your thoughts. Guys, hey, oh gosh.
Check. 1, 2, 1, 2.
All right, so check it out. Right here where Ray is. You guys go to Ray Rock, right here in the very front.
Check.
Yes, we get 4 minutes on the clock for the conclusions.
All right, in my opening statement, I point out you basically have a controversy. We know that there's a controversy going on, and we see how Christians are responding to that. And basically, up until Orthodoxy defines the two powers issue as a heresy, you had a wide range of views, a wide range of interpreting these various texts and so on. It's pretty clear what happens when Jesus comes along. And we looked. It's interesting, I quoted multiple passages in Mark, and I quoted Q, as far as Jesus saying that all things have been handed over to him by his Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. I quoted those because I assumed that he was going to reject John. And so I was quoting some of our earlier material, and then the Creed in Philippians and so on, where, I don't know if you noticed, but everyone seems to be doing the same thing. And it's the same issue that arises in the Old Testament. You have Yahweh sending Yahweh. You have Yahweh sending the angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord is Yahweh, and Yahweh says that he's the angel. You have the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So you have these issues, and people are confused about it. But then you look to the New Testament, and they're doing the exact same thing that was going on in the Old Testament, but now they're defining it as Father, Son, God, and the Word, but the Word is also God. Paul saying God, the Father is God, and Jesus is Lord. And they also bring in the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days with Jesus and so on. So you've got all these passages, they're all doing the same thing. It's pretty clear what's going on. And the question is, we look at what Jesus says. It sounds like he's claiming to be one of the two powers in heaven in multiple ways. We look at what Jesus does. He's claiming to do things like judge the world and raise the dead at the resurrection. We look at what his followers say. We look at what his followers do. We look at what his enemies say. We look at what his enemies do. And everything we can look at gives the indication that this guy was making claims that caused people to either worship him and start praying to him and doxologies and so on, or saying that this guy has to die. And if that's all just a miscommunication, this is like beyond anything else. You want to say Jesus wasn't the greatest communicator and so on because he slowly unveiled things for people who weren't ready to hear it. That's very different from saying everyone got the message horribly, horribly wrong. And so I just wanted to conclude here with the last minute. I wanted to revisit the famous quote from C.S. Lewis, that the trilemma, the problem with the trilemma was that it didn't rule out, it didn't include certain other options. So it's presented as Lord, Liar, Lunatic, but you've got the legend possibility that it doesn't include. What if all this is later legendary development? Well, we've seen that can't be the case because everyone concludes this. It's all over the place. It's in our earliest material, and we can trace this back to within 2 years of the formation of the church when Paul is persecuting the church. What's he doing? He was persecuting people for calling on the name of Jesus the way they're calling on the name of the Lord. This means that the early church had this view. And the other option would be Jesus is a terrible communicator and everyone misunderstood him. And that, I just have to say, again, given how Jesus taught, I can't believe that everyone was horribly misunderstanding. And so when we rule those out, I think we can agree with C.S. Lewis, who said, I'm trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I do not accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher or a terrible communicator. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to.
All right.
Sure.
Alex,
Actually,
4-minute closing. All right, 4-minute closing from Alex.
yeah, I mean, I guess there are a few important things to say. First is that I totally forgot in that entire section that I really, really did want to hear what David thinks about Jesus implying all throughout John chapter 17, that the relationship he has with the Father is the same as the relationship that the Father and he wish to have with all Christian believers. I find it quite stunning that when specifically asked to clarify his Christological position, he describes his relationship with the Father in terms that he then attributes to first his disciples and then the rest of Christian believers. Absent everything else that we've been saying, that alone should be pretty stunning. What can it possibly mean for Jesus to describe his relationship to the Father and then say, in the same way that I'm in him and he's in me, I want you all to be in us so we can all be one, all of us? What can that possibly mean? We didn't even get to discuss this. Maybe some people in the Q&A have some answers. But on its own, that is enough to raise some serious question marks. Of course, a lot of David's case has relied on this two powers heresy, and we were sort of getting a bit caught in the weeds there about the dating. I read a quote from James McGrath, which I didn't finish because it's quite long, but he goes on to say, and this is in The Only True God, early Christian monotheism in its Jewish context. He says, of course, conversely, the absence of evidence for the existence of the heresy in this period surveyed so far does not prove that it did not yet exist. Of course that's true. However, in view of the clear polemic against two powers in later writings, and the complete absence of such polemic in earlier writings, this at least strongly suggests the possibility that the two powers only became an issue for whatever reason in the period after those documents were put in their present form. In other words, this two powers discussion doesn't seem to crop up at all until it's too late to have influenced the high priest. And I want to know why, I suppose, that's the case. I want to know why it is that Jesus also says that the glory he receives from the Father will be given to the disciples and given to everybody else. I want to know why Jesus is given the authority to forgive sins, which at least is interpreted by his Jewish opponents as something only God can do, and then gives it to his disciples, the same authority at the end of John chapter 20, saying, as the Father has sent me, I'm now sending you. What is going on here? Why is Jesus passing on all of these divine prerogatives in unity to his disciples in precisely the way that he got them from the Father? If any of these instances, any of these divine, and same thing with judgment, by the way, which David keeps coming back to, which God also delegates to other people. Again, we haven't heard much response on these ideas of it's not just Jesus who gets to judge, but Jesus also delegates that judgment. The example I gave was delegating judgment of the 12 tribes of Israel to his disciples, which is something we're pretty sure he historically actually said, because he says that the 12 of you will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Meanwhile, Judas is currently present. So it's likely he actually said this, because it's not something a later Christian writer would make up. There are Christian interpretations as to why he would have still said 12, of course, but it's an unnatural thing for someone to have made up. So we think he actually said it. He's delegating his judgment. Why is Jesus taking all of these divine prerogatives and giving them to human beings, if he's more than just a human being himself? But of course, he's not just a human being qua his position. He's a very special kind of human being, someone who, according to the non-gospel New Testament sources, is exalted, given the name above every other name. Interesting implication for the divine name-bearing model, by the way. what is the best interpretation is all I basically have to ask of all of these points. I mean, we got quite caught up in there in the nature of blasphemy and what Jesus could have been claiming. Again, I'll just press the point that if you want to accept that Jesus couldn't have been accused of blasphemy for anything other than claiming to be Yahweh, and yet all he really did was quote Daniel 7, then you have to believe that at the time of Jesus' trial, it was popular enough within Jewish thought to expect that the coming Son of Man, as prophesied in Daniel 7, would be Yahweh himself. I don't see any evidence for that at all. So for these considerations, I think it a suspicious reading of the New Testament to say that Jesus was claiming identity with Yahweh.
All right. Before we go to the first question, I got one question for Alex, and I would love to hear your answer on this. I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in this whole thing. You've brought this up before, the idea in Eastern Orthodoxy of theosis or deification. Does that solve the dilemma that you're referring to? Theosis, the process of humans attaining likeness to and union with God, participating in the divine energies, divine nature, and experiencing community with the Holy Trinity. If we're adding the Eastern Orthodox position, which is within the realms of Orthodoxy, as Protestants would probably call that glorification, right? They're giving very specific language. Your dilemma is Jesus is God, and then he's given this godlike authority to his disciples. Could you concede potentially that that solves the dilemma?
Only if that also describes how Jesus relates to his own Father. Because, of course, constantly Jesus is using the word kathos, or kathos, which means just as, in the same way as. So, sure, maybe this is talking about a kind of elevation of humans to share in the likeness of God in some other kind of way, but...
Deification.
Deification. But then Jesus would have to see himself in the same way, which is in so many words what I'm trying to say Jesus was, in fact, doing. So, yes.
Okay, cool. All right, we're going to go to questions. Let's.
All right, we have 8
Ray Rock
minutes.
got it.
We're going to get through this real quick. We
Oh,
got
boy.
a question
Sorry,
from
everyone.
Avery. All right.
Oh, you hold the mic? Okay. All right, for sure. What's going on, guys? So this is a question for Alex, man. How you doing, man?
Hey,
You mentioned,
God logic.
Yes, yes, sir. You mentioned in Hebrews 1 where, God is speaking, or God spoke to our, through prophets. Now he speaks to us through his son, and you're saying, where was Jesus then, back then? He should have been active. And so, regarding Hebrews, I just want to read you this and get your thoughts on this, okay? It's Hebrews 11. Regarding Moses, it says, by faith, Moses, and I'm going to just skip down to 25 and 26 for time, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So how is it that Moses can be considering Christ's disapproval if Christ wasn't around for him to disapprove?
Yeah, that is a great question. So Christ there, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Now, that's something which I think it's a good point. I mean, of course, I can offer a Christological interpretation of this, which sort of says that Christ is promised as the Redeemer of mankind, and we're looking at this in retro. Where's he gone? Oh, there you are. And we're looking, and just dropped it and left. And I suppose we're looking at this in retrospect, and he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Yeah, I do think that in this instance, Hebrews is probably presenting Jesus as... I don't know about the angel of Yahweh, but certainly we're looking at a high Christology in Hebrews, yeah.
So close.
But, yeah, I see what you're saying.
All right, let's go to the next question because we only got a few.
He's so close, guys.
But I have no, for what it's worth, I have no problem saying that Hebrews has a high Christology. That's kind of not an issue to me. But I think it is interesting to suggest that as a retort to the idea of the angel of Yahweh being Jesus, I think that is an excellent point. Yeah.
Great job, Avery. All right, we got a question for David Wood real quick.
Gentlemen, thank you for a wonderful debate. Dr. Wood, regarding the I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John, the most palpable, powerful, divine statements by Christ, why do you believe that they are omitted from Mark, from Q, from Matthew, and Luke, our 4 earliest Gospels, and then John comes along, and these statements are present in John and missing from all of our other sources?
Did I bring up I am statements? No. Who brought them up? That's
I suppose
interesting.
the question...
It is fascinating if you walk in and you say, all right, I'm going to quote all these passages in John. They go, it's too late. It's the latest source. You can't trust that. It's clearly made up later and so on. And so you say, okay, let me just go with the earliest material, go Q, Mark, and Paul. And then it's, well, what about John? That's very interesting. So I can't quote John, but they can quote John. These are awesome times. I think the Synoptic Gospel writers are focusing on different theological issues. And so in Mark, for instance, you have the announcement. You have the announcement that John the Baptist is preparing the way for Jesus, but he actually quotes Isaiah that the messenger is going to prepare the way for the Lord. And so if you look at how it unfolds, it's raising all these questions. Who is this guy who says he can forgive sins? This guy says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath. You do have an I am statement there in Mark 6:50, but there are passages where it could just be translated as it is I, which is why I don't point to these, but they are there, and that's the context where it would make sense. Because this is a really powerful religious moment for them. So you could interpret it that way, but since it's kind of ambiguous, I don't. But as far as why material is quoted in John that's not quoted in other Gospels, again, I think they're focusing on different issues. You look at Mark, it's very action-based. Jesus went here, did this. Jesus went here, there, and did that. And yet you have it unfolding to who Jesus is claiming to be. He eventually gets to the point where once his followers grant that he's the Messiah, then he starts modifying people's expectations of what the Messiah is. That's when you have him saying, well, how does David call the Messiah Lord if he's just the son of David? And then you eventually get to the trial, and it's this guy has to die. But this is just, Jesus went here and did this. It's not focusing a lot on Jesus' teaching. And then you get Matthew, he takes the same material, but he includes some long sermons and so on, so he's including that material. Luke focuses more on parables and so on, and John just focuses more on personal encounters with Jesus. That's why you get his interactions with Nicodemus and the woman at the well, and Mary and Martha and Lazarus, focusing on personal encounters and some of the Christological claims. But one of the mistakes people make is saying, lots of scholars make this mistake, is John must be late because of all this high Christology and Christological statement. It doesn't make any sense because we know when Paul was writing, and you can't say John is somehow has a higher Christology than what you find in Paul. So we know the extremely high Christology is very, very early. But yeah, I think the writers are focusing on different things.
All right, I'm gonna try to sneak in two real quick. Here's a quick one.
Hey, Stephen Nelson from Cross Bible. I have a question about Philippians 2, 6 through 7.
Is it about the Greek?
You both argued about it, yeah. You use different translations of the Greek word morphe. So on one side we have the translation of form, and on the other side we have the translation of nature. Now nature is coming from the NIV, who being in very nature God, and then take the NASB for morphe, who as he already existed in the form of God, in morphitheu, and then he takes on the form of a servant, morphidulu. So can you guys justify why you prefer those specific translations that you used of the Greek word morphe in the Christ hymn in Philippians 2?
Let's start with Alex.
Sure. So the context in which I think I brought that up, unless I'm misremembering, is James Dunn's interpretation of the passage. So I suppose I'm trying to make that passage make sense in light of my view. It could be wrong. It could be the wrong idea. It could mean existing in the form of God in the sense of being like an exalted being, exalted to the level of God. That might be the case. I don't exactly have a preference. To me, the question of Paul's Christology is secondary to the question of Jesus claiming to be God. Of course, it is interesting why Paul might have a high Christology, or that itself is, of course, debated. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore, but I'm happy for the sake of argument to just grant that Paul had a high Christology. So I don't know which is the best interpretation. I think you would be a much better person to inform. And in fact, I'd like to know your opinion. I spoke to this chap earlier, and you you run a biblical Greek cross-comparison website. So I would love to know what your interpretation of the verse is. Or the word, I mean, morphe.
Yeah, that was asked to both of us, I think. But as far as, yeah, I mean, the morphe would, the most obvious translation would be like form or shape or something like that. What the NIV writers are doing is saying, if someone's in the form of God, what are you saying? If I say he was in the form of God, then this happened. Sounds like you're saying somehow in nature God. And so that's their that's the interpretation. I think that's good, so I'm fine. I think that's the meaning, and therefore, the NIV frequently translates according to the meaning and not like a literal definition. But if someone's in the form of God, I think it makes sense to say in nature God. What doesn't make sense is what Dunn does is he takes it as like this means the image of God, and it just doesn't make sense with the rest of the passage.
Something that is worth pointing out, I suppose, is that the same word morphe is used in the long ending of Mark, where Jesus appears in a different form to two of them. So if morphe is supposed to mean sort of essence, as in the morphe of God meaning like having the same sort of essence as God, if that's what it's supposed to mean, then it's unclear why the writers of the long ending of Mark would say that he appeared to two other people in a different morphe. It seems to maybe imply something.
No, that makes perfect sense. If I say someone changes appearance or something like that, then that makes perfect sense. If I say someone is in the form of God, what could that possibly mean? What does it mean to be in the form of God? That's what they're saying. What does it mean to be in the form of God? You have to be, there's got to be something. There's got to be something about being in nature God.
Yeah.
What else is in the form of God? I can understand what, if I could change my form, I know what it would mean to change into the form of that guy.
Yeah, well, of course,
I don't know what it would be to change in the form of God.
If Dunn's interpretation is correct, which I don't know if it is, but I think it's an interesting one to consider, then morphe in that context is talking about being made in the image of God, and so to be in the form of God means to be made in the image of God, and so to appear to someone in a different form means to look different, perhaps. It seems perfectly consistent, in other words. I don't think
it just makes no sense because that's before he makes himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant being made in human
Yeah, that's
likeness.
the problem. I think that's the problem with Dunn's interpretation here, but it's not a problem with the word morphe, which we can discuss that if you like.
As far as the translation, totally fine with saying
actually,
he was in the form of God and then made himself nothing.
It depends on how deep the form goes, but the key is that in verse 7 he takes on the form of a servant. So he starts out in a divine form and then descends into taking his human form.
Which I think is what David was getting at as well, right? Yeah. Well, thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to sneak this last one in here.
Sure, fine by me.
Appreciate it. So this one's for Alex primarily. Okay, so in the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 38b, there's a rabbinic discussion about Daniel chapter 7, and they're asking about the verse, I looked till thrones, plural, were placed. It says, one throne is for him and one throne is for David. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yosei said to him, Akiva, blah, blah, blah. Rather, the correct interpretation is that both thrones are for God, as one throne is for justice and the other is for mercy. So why would the rabbis, because you're asking about what did the high priest interpret the passage to mean? So why would the later rabbis of the 2nd century, or of the late 1st century, have come up with an interpretation saying the Son of Man is God after the advent of Christianity?
Right, okay, so the passage says that there are two, this is from Sanhedrin, right?
Yes.
That there are two thrones, one for justice, one for mercy.
Yes, and this is referring to the rabbinic concept of Hamidot, the two forms of God, justice and mercy, Elohim and Adonai.
Sure. Okay, so in this interpretation, which is Jesus and which is the Father?
Well,
if what I mean to say is, if this is the interpretation in mind, you
might need to clarify your point.
Which is the Father and which is Jesus? Justice or mercy? Which is which?
No. I'm simply asking because you said that you said it was implausible to suggest that the high priest would have interpreted that the Son of Man in Daniel 7 is
Say
Yahweh.
what you said at the beginning first about who said what and what the response was.
So Rabbi Akiva said, one throne is for the Holy One and the other is for David, meaning the Messiah. And then Rabbi Yosei rebukes him and says, no, both thrones, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, are for God. So that would be identifying the Son of Man as God.
I see. And so the Son of Man in this instance is mercy and God is justice, or is it the other way around?
That's all Rabbi Yosei says.
But he then says that, he then explains what the two thrones are for, right? What does he say the two thrones are for?
He says one is for justice
and one is for mercy.
So
if the two thrones are for the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, the Ancient of Days is justice and the Son of Man is
No.
mercy? Or
No,
what?
yeah, let me clarify. Let me clarify.
maybe
So the point is when it talks about the two thrones, the two thrones being brought, that Rabbi Akiva says, okay, one is for God and one's for the Messiah. And someone else responds, whoa. You cannot say that one of these thrones is for the Messiah. They both have to be for God. They both have to be for God. So they're interpreting the thrones as both having to be for God, and they sort of describe it as God's attributes are on these thrones. That's
why I don't know why anybody groaned at the question I was asking. If it's God's attributes which are on the throne, and this is being discussed in the context of the Son of Man.
The point is, when you say this is a human being, that the Son of Man is a human being, Rabbi Akiva said, hey, that's the Messiah. And other people said, whoa, you can't say that because this is clearly a throne for the divine, but there's only one God, and therefore both thrones are for God, and we got to separate the attributes.
Maybe I'm still just mishearing this, but after saying that, the explanation is that the two thrones, one is for justice, one is for mercy, which you described as God's attributes.
Oh, sorry. I shouldn't take the mic. So if I have been brought back up to clarify my question.
Sure.
I'm so sorry.
He's back.
I've been brought back up to clarify my question. So,
going back.
Alex, what I'm asking is, so which figure is justice and which one is mercy is not really it's not really relevant here. I'm just saying. It's rather that this is showing that rabbis after the advent of Christianity were recognizing the Son of Man in Daniel 7 as an explicitly divine figure. Because when Rabbi Akiva says, oh, it's the Messiah, he says, no, both figures, the two distinct figures, are God.
Oh, sorry, yeah, okay, so wait, so after the advent of Christianity, so when are you talking about? You said after the advent of Christianity, when are you talking about?
He's saying that they've had this argument already, and that within the Jewish Talmud, they're arguing about this throne for two gods.
The point is there are rabbis who interpreted the Son of Man as
God.
Okay, look. For fear of...
Because you said it was implausible. That's what he was responding to. Earlier you said it was implausible.
I understand that part. For fear of further misunderstanding and further groans from the audience, I fear I would want to read that passage on paper in front of me, which maybe... Where's he gone? There you are. Can you speak to me after class?
Let's give him a round of applause, y'all.
Oh, my gosh. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes Alex O'Connor versus David Wood, the Jesus claim to be God. You guys are getting a standing applause.
That was fun. Yeah. That was fun.
You guys can do better than that.
Wow. I did not tell them to do that. That was completely unprovoked.
Thank you.